Hello, my name is Will Arkwright, and I will be doing the environmental history of Rochester Hills, which is where I grew up. Rochester and Rochester Hills was settled by James Graham in 1817, becoming the first settlement in Oakland County. Graham was an Irishman fleeing Europe in search of a more prosperous life in the untouched lands of the United States. The surrounding area was rich in natural resources like lumber and had a close proximity to many rivers and creeks. This abundance of natural resources allowed Rochester Hills and its neighboring town, Stony Creek, to construct waterways that powered mills. Mills were used to press cider, grind grain, cut lumber, and card wool. Generally speaking, early Rochester had very little to worry about in terms of natural resources and economic wealth. Much of its residents were made up of rural family farms that made efforts to remain self-sufficient. It was common knowledge at the time that small towns near transportation thrived, and so residents bought 50,000 in railroad stocks to ensure that the railroad, the Michigan Central Railroad, ran through Rochester. This financial move paid off, turning the small town of Rochester into a prosperous rural market. As such, Rochester Hills successfully commodified the surrounding area, turning once thick forests, flowing creeks, and meandering rivers into profitable mills and farmland. To me, early Rochester is a perfect example of humanity's relationship with nature and the inevitable commodification that comes after people settle somewhere. Graham was a European. He was a European colonist, so he likely had views of nature that were biblical, viewing nature as something pure and virgin to be conquered. This story is not necessarily unique to Rochester, but it is simply an unfortunate reality of American colonization. There is conflicting evidence as to whether native tribes were in the settlement that Graham founded before it was colonized. Some sources say that indigenous populations in the area were very small, and that by the time pioneers settled in, many of the Native American population had just moved on. However, other sources claim that a coalition of tribes known as the Penacooks lived and thrived in an area around the Rochester before their numbers dwindled from disease due to colonization. Although the image of guilt-free land being settled is nice, historically speaking, the reality may have been more grim than many Rochester residents are led to believe. As capitalism evolved in the United States, as did the developing town of Rochester, soon mills and farmland turned into factories and small auto shops to support an increasingly industrial economy. Many of the once rural family farmers left for the cities, causing a resulting land boom. This boom brought with it many housing subdivisions and large regal estates for wealthy city workers. Any remaining farmland from the previous century was replaced or turned into historic sites to maintain the town's history. This, again, is reminiscent of the commodification of nature. Urban privatization of land pushing rural farmers into cities, working as wage laborers for auto factories, uprooting and exploitation of timber and fresh water, the exiling and genocide of native tribes were all things we discussed in previous lectures. Rochester's religious history is unique. It starts with a man by the name of Uriah Adams. Uriah Adams was a known religious fanatic and eccentric man. Uriah was an avid follower of the Millerite movement that swept the nation during the 1840s. Millerites believed that the end of the world was doomed to happen during March of 1843, which that year tended to shift, as time went on. Uriah, having gained a cult-like following, spread the word to the rest of the town, filling it with the same sense of bizarre fanaticism. As the, quote, end days approach, residents paid off debts, sold their homes, and threw out their worldly possessions. When the day came, residents were disappointed to find, well, another day, and called the movement the Great Disappointment. Uriah went into hiding shortly after the incident to avoid the consequences, but he went on to spread similar hysteria. Nowadays, Rochester's religion is still primarily Catholic Christian, but has no such religious fanaticism as it did previously. The mostly Christian population was likely due to the settlers' Catholic influence, which prevails even today. Rochester Hill's demographic is largely dominated by white people. Being a northern city founded by European pioneers, it's easy to imagine why Rochester's demographic is the way it is. Rochester Hills is also well known for its successful blue ribbon schools, which encourage some foreigners to immigrate and to give their children a more successful high school education. The race demographics of Rochester Hills, for the most part, mimic the race demographics of the United States, mostly because the majority of small towns in the U.S. have a very similar story as Rochester Hills, being small towns founded and colonized by primarily white and Christian Europeans. As stated previously, Rochester used to get most of its food, water, and energy from self-sustaining and rural family farms. However, as industrialization spread and the population grew, there needed to be new and more efficient ways to transport water, food, and energy to Rochester. In terms of water, Rochester Hills taps into the second largest Great Lake, Lake Huron, providing ample supplies to the suburban communities. Energy in the city is produced largely by natural gas and coal, with a small reliance on nuclear and sustainable energy sources. Although Rochester relies mostly on fossil fuels, it has a severe lack of coal mines and natural gas to speak of. As such, it must send money outside of the community to purchase fossil fuels in order to power the community. For food, Rochester Hills gets almost all of its food from chain brand supermarket stores, which sprang up in more recent decades as an answer to the growth in American consumerism. Rochester Hills was built on water-powered mills and agriculture, and takes steps in preserving that history. As such, there are a variety of museums that tell the history of the area, including the popular Van Hoosen Farm, which shows off and preserves the agricultural history of the community. The town has also taken steps to preserve the natural beauty of the town through parks and trails and protected nature areas. Historically, Rochester has always been an area of affluence, and based on how things have been going, I don't think that's subject to change anytime soon. Due to the city's strong historical appreciation, I have a feeling that the wilderness and environmental protection in the area will likely stand to increase. Although the reliance on coal and natural gas is worrying, most of the energy used in Rochester Hills comes from outside of the community. As such, the community does not suffer from the harmful effects of fracking or coal extraction. I hope that the area eventually does shift in favor of more renewable resources, though. Thank you for listening.